Hi everyone, welcome back to Social Behavioral Sciences 304 Research Methods. Last week we had a welcome and syllabus day where we kind of did an overview of the course and set you up for what to expect. Today we're going to go through our first lecture of the course, and I just want to encourage you that this lecture is going to be the longest and most complicated we'll have in the first half of the course. That's because I really need to get 2 chapters in to set the stage for what we're doing next. Most weeks we'll only cover 1 chapter, so please don't become discouraged if this lecture is a little overwhelming for you. I've provided some understanding checks at the midpoint and then again toward the end. So that should help you know whether you've really gotten the gist of the lecture. And of course you can ask questions in the discussion forum or email me directly. So I'm going to move through at a pretty quick pace. So write down your questions. Feel free to, watch this video in a couple of segments so you can really digest what you're hearing. So first I want to address some of your concerns that you expressed in last week's discussion forum. Your main concerns were work management, choosing a research topic, and participating in an online course. So in terms of work management, I want to encourage you to plan ahead. You will be getting weekly emails from me on Monday afternoons telling you kind of what to expect and what to do for the week. This will include relevant due dates and deadlines, as well as just an overview of what the week will hold. So enter your course schedule into your course calendar. The sooner you do this, the happier you'll be, so that you know when upcoming due dates are going to happen. But also block off time to work on this course. So block off an hour and 20 minutes a week to listen to the lecture, and then an additional 20 or so minutes to participate in the discussion forum. Catch up quickly. If you get behind, and I assume that most people will get behind at least a little bit at some point, catch up quickly. Don't let it get on top of you. So if you miss a lecture on Tuesday, hurry and watch it on Wednesday. Don't wait until the next week and think I'll just do 2 lectures next week. Get ahead right away. And schedule check-in meetings with me. You don't have to wait until something's wrong to schedule a meeting. If you want to, you can click on my calendar link right now and schedule a meeting every 2 weeks just to check in and see how you're doing. So schedule check-in meetings with me if you want to, if that helps you have accountability. You also expressed a lot of concern about choosing a research topic, and I just want to encourage you, this is important. You're going to be working on it for the next 2 years. It really matters, but it's not career defining. So don't feel like this is the be-all end-all of your research agenda from here until forever. It matters what you do for your college senior, research project, but it won't define where you go from here in a career, right? It can work into a larger research agenda later if that's what you want, but it doesn't have to. I want to encourage you to focus on feasibility. Focus on a research project that you can complete in the next 2 years with the resources available to an undergraduate. Focus on the doable. If you realize that you've bitten off more than you can chew, or you realize that your project is too narrow and you're not going to have enough scope to do your research, or if you realize that you hate your topic and just can't bear to work on it for the next 2 years, correct course early. The sooner you realize you have doubts about feasibility or about your willingness to do the work, make necessary changes. Don't wait until you're in theory and you're supposed to be finally proposing your research. Do it right away. And finally, only 1 or 2 of you have scheduled meetings with me to discuss your research topic. It's never too early. Hurry and do that, because the week before it's due, everybody will want to talk to me, and you may not be able to find a time. So schedule meetings with me right away to discuss your research topic. I'm happy to help you narrow it down. Online participation. I listened to your concerns and have scheduled optional weekly lab meetings. So every Wednesday at 12:30 to 1:50, I will be conducting a Teams meeting that will allow you to participate in the lab exercise together, ask questions, get input from me, get input from one another. These are completely optional and won't be graded in any way. I don't care if you show up or not. As long as at least one or two people show up, I will record the meeting and, oh, that's my cat. I will record the meeting and post it for people who can't attend. If nobody shows up within the first 15 minutes, so by 12:45, I'll go ahead and cancel the meeting and just assume we didn't need it that week. Of course, you can always schedule individual meetings with me. Don't work in isolation. So the hardest part about managing work in an online course is isolation. Don't let it happen. Form study groups early. Use GroupMe to form study groups, get an accountability partner, make friends with one another. Use Google Docs to study together. Use Google Docs to do the lab exercises together, to study for exams together, to do understanding checks with each other, and schedule tutoring through the Academic Resource Center. Again, I want to emphasize that I'm available and you can schedule meetings with me to check in and see how you're doing. Just like you would talk to me in class or after class, you can schedule meetings. So I want to move right into today's lecture. First, I want to say that I appreciate you expressing concerns in the discussion forums, and I want to encourage you to continue doing that. So I hope this has been a useful response. I'll also try to respond in the forums more actively, but you can also email me if you have a direct concern. So today we're going to discuss what is social science research. Just get the lay of the land, figure out what we're doing in this course. So the first things I want us to talk about are why we do research, types of research we can do, and research questions and goals. Why we do social science research. Social science research is a really powerful tool for understanding the social world around us. So, coming from disciplines such as sociology, political science, and global comparative studies, we may be very interested in things like hierarchies of power and the conditions of human lives, as well as the conditions of political structures in different nations, social structures in different nations. Social science research allows us to systematically observe all of these questions. Social science research allows us to observe patterns and discover principles. What I mean by that is we can look at phenomena as they occur and observe when things seem to happen in predictable ways, and maybe even discover principles that allow us to predict what will happen next. It allows us to discover what's common to a society or to all societies, and what's unique to an individual or to a specific society. It also allows us to answer questions like, which factors affect which outcomes? For example, does a country's political openness affect its GDP? Or does a community's religious participation affect individual mental health? So we can ask questions about the social world around us, and we can apply our research in ways that make human lives better. Often, that's the underlying goal, whether we state it or not. It's part of the goal that a lot of social scientists have, that is the reason we do social science in the first place, is that we care about society, we care about human beings, and we want to make human lives better. Now, I've put a little asterisk next to the word better, because what makes somebody's life better or what makes society better is open to interpretation. Different people are going to feel that different things make the world a better place. but we can all use social science research to make that kind of attempt. We can do this in a couple of ways. As researchers, we can provide data that are used by others to make the world a better place, or we can do research that places us in the midst of interventions. So we'll talk more about that in a moment, but we can be activists through our research, or we can kind of create knowledge that can be applied in a variety of ways. So this brings me to the distinction between basic research, which is also, when I was coming up, it was called pure research, and applied research. So these are two different types of research. In basic or pure research, the goal is to generate knowledge for the sake of generating knowledge. Often we have a vision for how that knowledge could be used, but we don't get to dictate that as researchers. We ask questions about the world around us, collect data. We can use this system of question asking and data gathering to illuminate new ways of thinking. Just because it's called basic or pure doesn't mean it can't be powerful. We can ask questions that change people's ways of conceiving of the world. This can be an amazingly powerful thing to do, but it's generally done by academics in the context of the academy. It's generally not directly used to intervene in people's lives or in the life of a society. This is in contrast to applied research. Applied research is research that's done in the attempt to solve a problem, or to evaluate a solution to a problem. So an example of applied research might be an experiment where I would give a basic income to a certain sample of people within a community. The goal being to make those people's lives better. Or I could be one step back from that process and evaluate the outcomes of that intervention. I could also do research in ways that are collaborative with my target population. So in ways that put me in a conversation with the people I'm studying to do research that's directly useful to them. So perhaps a community center is running an after-school tutoring program, and they want to know how effective that program is in reducing drug use. I could, as a researcher, come in and work with them to evaluate that program in a way that would be helpful to them. It would put me in collaboration with them, and it's research that's done by activists or practitioners. So it's research that's typically done, it can be done by people with advanced degrees, but it's typically done in the context of the community or the society, rather than the context of the university or the college. Some other types of research we might conduct relate to what we're trying to learn from our research. Not what we've talked about what we're trying to do with our research, whether we're just trying to generate knowledge or whether we're trying to solve a problem directly. There's another kind of distinction we can make. That's between qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative research comes from the Latin qualia. Qualia means what is it like? What is the experience of something? And as the name implies, qualitative research asks questions that center on subjective experience. So questions about what a person or a community experiences related to a phenomenon. And answers generally take the form of narratives or observations. So if I want to know about the protests taking place around the Black Lives Matter movement right now, I might want to know a lot of things, but some of the things I might want to know are like, why are people joining these protest movements? And what is it like to be part of these protest movements? What kinds of experiences are the people involved having? What kinds of discussions are they having with each other? What kinds of interactions are they having with institutions of power? So, if I wanted to know the answers to these questions, I might interview participants in these protests. Or I might go to a protest and, from a distance or on the ground, try to observe what's happening directly. So, my answers to my questions would take the form of narratives, what people tell me, or observations, what I can see and make sense of for myself. And sometimes I would do both of those things. I would ask people questions to kind of check my observations, or I would ask people for their impressions, and then I would go and observe to see if I could confirm those impressions. Another form of research social scientists may do, and this is more often what we think of when we think of social science research, is quantitative. Quantitative comes from the Latin root that means how many or how much, quanta. And the questions in quantitative research center on objective measures. What is the count? What is the volume? What is the extent of something? So answers are generally reducible to numbers and take the form of counts or scales. So an example of this, going back to the Black Lives Matter protests, I might want to know how many people attend most protest events and how many people attend with each kind of political agenda. So how many people would consider themselves counter-protesters? I might also want to know some of the demographics of people involved. How many people are young? How many people are above a certain age? How many people do things like serve as medics? How many people serve as reporters or journalists? How many people bring weapons or objects that could be used as weapons to these protests? How many people engage in behaviors that are being highlighted by the media, such as looting? What proportion of the people who attend engage in confrontations with police directly versus what proportion just show up and peacefully protest with no disruption, right? So these answers would take the form of numbers, counts. I could also get people's opinions using a count. So, for example, how many people would agree with certain statements about the protest? Maybe I have interviewed some people and gotten their opinions and perspectives. And then I want to ask questions like, how many people agree with this perspective? The answer is an opinion, but it's still reducible to a number. Mixed methods are simply studies that combine qualitative and quantitative approaches. So I could take a survey of Black Lives Matter protest participants and find out how many people are younger, how many people are older, how many people identify with a certain political orientation, how many people are of a certain race, ethnic background, etc. And then I could go and observe a protest and see what that looks like in practice, right? Or I could interview people to get ideas about what it's like to be in one of these protest movements, and then take a survey to kind of confirm my understanding. So that would be a mixed method study if I did both approaches in some combination. Okay. So qualitative means what is it like, quantitative means how many or how much, and mixed methods combines these kinds of questions. Another kind of distinction we can make in terms of types of research study is what kind of design we use. Another way to frame this is what kind of information are we trying to gather? Cross-sectional data is data that's a snapshot of what's going on. It's basically information or data gathered at one point in time. So a way of thinking of this is I could attend a protest and I could interview people on the street. I could interview them on the night of August 31st in the town of Kenosha. This would provide a snapshot of what's happening. I could also do repeated cross sections. So I could study all the protests that happen in the city of Kenosha, right? So I could start tonight, August 31st, and then I could go on September 1st, September 2nd, September 3rd, and get repeated kind of snapshots. A fact to remember is that even if I do snapshots in a repeated fashion, I'm still gathering cross-sectional data. So even if I interview all the people who protest related to Black Lives Matter in a given city over several days, I'm just collecting snapshots. Longitudinal means over time. Research collected over time, or information gathered over time. So this is different from cross sections. If a cross section is a snapshot, longitudinal data is like a movie. I'm not just capturing information at one point in time. I'm capturing information on the same individuals at multiple points in time. It's not immediately clear how this differs from repeated cross sections. A repeated cross section would be if I went to, moving away from my Black Lives Matter example, if I went to a bus stop and I interviewed all the people at that bus stop, and then the next day I interviewed all the people at that bus stop again, there might be some overlap. Some of the same people are probably catching the same bus day after day, but there's also going to be some change, some turnover. I'm not going to get information on the same individuals just because I went to the same place at different times. Longitudinal data would be if I went to the bus stop on Tuesday morning and I interviewed all the people at that bus stop and I collected all of their contact information. And then I interviewed them every week on their experiences riding the bus. I could get information on the same individuals over and over and over and over a long period of time, maybe years. That's longitudinal. That's data collected over time on the same individuals at multiple time points. What's important about longitudinal relationships, and we'll talk more about this later, is that it has the potential to establish causal relationships. So if I know what somebody was doing at one time, and then I know how they're doing later, I might be able to say, hey, something about what they were doing at time 1 predicted what happened at time 3. So I might be able to say that one thing caused another thing. We'll get into that more later, but what's important to know is that you can only make causal relationship or establish causal relationships with longitudinal data collected over time. You can't do that with cross-sectional research that's a snapshot. We'll talk more about that later. So this brings us to a discussion of correlation versus causation. Many of you will have heard by now the statement that correlation does not equal causation. And this is true. We're going to talk about why this is true now. Correlation simply means that two things vary together, that two things change together. As one thing changes, another thing also changes. An example of this would be that as ice cream sales increase, drowning deaths increase. Now, on its face, this makes no sense, even though it's a true statement. What could ice cream sales possibly have to do with drowning deaths? Well, when do we buy ice cream? When it's hot outside. And when do we experience drowning deaths? When people go swimming, which happens when it's hot outside. So, as ice cream sales increase, drowning deaths increase is a true statement. Those two ideas are correlated. But it would be foolish to suggest that ice cream sales cause drowning deaths, or that drowning deaths cause an increase in ice cream sales. The two things are related, but one certainly doesn't cause the other. A less obvious example comes from my master's degree research. I found that prayer, how often an individual prays to God, is associated with higher levels of anxiety. As prayer increases, anxiety increases. Now, this might seem to make no sense at all. Most people find prayer comforting. Most people who pray believe that prayer makes their lives better. So why would it lead to an increase in anxiety? Well, it doesn't. It turns out that anxious people pray more. It turns out that religious people who have higher levels of anxiety are more likely to pray more often because they're anxious. So just because one thing relates to another thing doesn't mean that that thing causes the other thing. Prayer doesn't cause anxiety. Anxiety may actually cause an increase in prayer. Now, I can't establish that that's the case, that anxiety causes prayer, because I only had cross-sectional data. I only had data taken at a snapshot in time, a single point in time. So I can't say that people who are more anxious before pray more later, which is what I would need to be able to say to establish that anxiety causes prayer. Now, if I had interviewed the same people at 3 points in time, I would be able to say people who are really anxious at time 1 were more likely to have prayed more often at time 2 and time 3. And then I would be able to say being anxious in the first place causes prayer later, which is what I would need to be able to say. Another thing we might think that might be less obvious, and this doesn't come from any research I've done, that as protest participation increases, voting rates decrease. We might observe that in countries where people are participating in a lot of protests, people aren't participating in electoral politics very much. They're not voting very often. And we might think that this is because protests deter voting. But that's not necessarily true. It could be the opposite. It could be that in countries with less vibrant or less free elections, people are more likely to become frustrated enough to protest. And if we collect information on this question over time, we could establish that kind of causation. But if we only take a snapshot, if we collect data only at a single point in time, all we can do is establish how frequent protests are, or how many people participate in protests, and how many people vote. So let's say we measured only a single year. We could say what proportion of the population participated in a protest in the past year, and what proportion of people voted in the most recent election. That would allow us to establish whether protest participation is correlated with voting rates. But it wouldn't let us know whether voting led to protests, or whether protests led to voting, or whether neither thing was true. Some third thing could cause both protesting and voting rates. So, for example, an increase in authoritarianism could both cause people to protest and cause people to vote less frequently. That would be similar to our ice cream and drowning example. What you need to understand from this slide is that correlation and causation are different. Things can be correlated but not have a causal relationship with each other. And that when all the data we have are cross-sectional, we can't establish whether one thing causes another, although we can often establish whether two things are correlated. So I've already kind of discussed this. Causation is the claim that X causes Y to happen. An example would be shoe wearing in an area increases average IQ in the area. We would think that shoe wearing might cause an increase in average IQ. We could also argue that having a higher average IQ will increase shoe wearing because maybe smarter people are more likely to wear shoes. I take this example from historical research on the U.S. South before and after the Civil War. People were very commonly barefoot in the rural South immediately following the Civil War because of devastated infrastructure and devastated economy following the war. People were frequently shoeless. This led to hookworm infection. Hookworm infection caused anemia and stunted growth, which caused cognitive deficits. So the stereotype of the stupid, lazy Southerner may have been directly related to Southern people not being able to prevent hookworm infection because they did not have shoes. So we might hypothesize that shoe wearing will increase the average IQ in an area. We might also observe that as injection drug use increases, average age decreases. Why might this be? This might be because people are dying younger and not living to be very old in an area with high rates of injection drug use. But in order to establish causal relationships, we have to have longitudinal research. This is for three reasons that we're going to talk about now. The first is establishing temporal priority. In order for X to cause Y, X has to happen before Y. So we wouldn't expect that taking the example of eating vegetables and growing taller. How many of you have heard, eat your vegetables so you can grow up to be big and strong, right? We wouldn't hypothesize that being big and strong causes people to eat more vegetables as children, right? Why not? Well, that would make no sense. Growing up to be big and strong is a result. It happens later. Once you're grown up, you can't go back in time and do things as a child. So instead, we would expect that eating vegetables as a child causes people to grow up to be big and strong. X happens before Y, so it's possible that X causes Y. Another standard we have to meet in order to make causal arguments is logical priority. X has to have the potential to affect Y or influence Y. So logical priority, an example might be sleep and test scores, right? If you get a lot of sleep, you might make better test grades. It doesn't make a lot of sense to say that if you make better test grades, you get more hours of sleep. Your test grades don't really have the potential to influence. Now, of course, you could say that somebody who's failing school might lose sleep over their grades, or that someone who stays up late to study might make better grades. But in general, hours of sleep come logically prior to test scores. We don't expect that people with higher grades sleep more hours, and or fewer hours. because we don't expect that test scores affect sleeping. We expect that how many hours of sleep you get could affect your test scores. We also have to be able to rule out other explanations, such as spuriousness. Spuriousness is like our example of ice cream sales and drowning, thinking back to the previous slide, where a third factor, Z, causes both X and Y. So in the ice cream and drowning example, hot weather causes both an increase in ice cream sales and an increase in drowning. We can't say that ice cream sales cause drowning, and we can't say that drowning causes ice cream sales. Instead, a third factor, hot weather, causes both ice cream sales and drowning. This is a spurious relationship. We can observe that ice cream sales are related to drowning, but there's no causal relationship there at all. Another thing we need to consider in terms of doing social science research is our unit of analysis. This is a fancy way of saying we have to know what we're studying. We have to actually know what the entity is that we're studying. So let's say that I want to know what the average political orientation of the city of Birmingham is. That is, I want to know on average how conservative or liberal are people in Birmingham. Well, there are lots of things I could mean by that. In the city of Birmingham, I could want to know by neighborhood, how many neighborhoods are conservative versus liberal. I could want to know how conservative or liberal is the average resident. Or I could want to know how conservative or liberal is Birmingham compared to other cities in Alabama or other cities in the United States. So I have to know what level of abstraction I'm actually talking about. Am I talking about the city? Am I talking about neighborhoods within the city, or am I talking about people within neighborhoods within the city? This can, if we fail to consider unit of analysis, we can commit something called the ecological fallacy. An ecological fallacy is when I assume something about an individual person or community based on averages for a larger unit of analysis. So what if I knew, for example, that Birmingham was on average more liberal than conservative, College Hills was more liberal than Birmingham on average, and much more liberal than Vestavia Hills. Now, I'm just guessing. I don't actually know anything about this. But let's just say that I knew that residents of College Hills were especially liberal, even for Birmingham, which was fairly liberal overall. And I know that you live in College Hills. Would it be fair for me to say that because you live in College Hills, you're necessarily politically liberal? Definitely not. I don't know that about you. I can't even assume that neighborhoods in Birmingham are especially liberal. Just because Birmingham is more liberal overall, I might find that some neighborhoods are much more conservative than Birmingham as a city, right? So if I don't know what my unit of analysis is, what level I'm measuring at, then I can commit a fallacy, a logical fallacy, a mistaken judgment, where I think that because something is true of a larger group, it must be true of an individual that's a member of that group. That's not accurate, and we have to guard against it. So this brings us to asking research questions. Your book emphasizes asking value-free questions. I want to give you 2 points, 2 standards that social science research questions need to meet. First, they have to be answerable through social science research. Now, this sounds like a given, But a major problem students run into when designing research questions or research topics is that they choose a question that's not answerable through social science research. So my research for my master's degree related to religion. A question I can't answer through social science research would be, is there a God? Right? There's no way to know that given the mechanisms available through social science research. Just like you can't answer certain questions through chemistry because chemistry is limited in what it can measure, what it can study, what kinds of questions it can answer. Social science research is limited in similar ways. We can answer questions about human behavior in groups. We can answer questions about social institutions and social structures. We can answer questions about human interaction. We can't know things that are philosophical or biological in nature through social science research. That doesn't mean we can't know those things. It means we can't know them through social science research. Choose an answerable question. Now, your book emphasizes answering value-free questions. That means questions that don't assume that one answer is better than another. An example of a value-laden question would be, why are poor people lazy? This is a question that social scientists have asked for a long time because a cultural assumption in the United States was that poor people were lazy, that people were poor because they didn't work. And that if we wanted to understand poverty, the root of the problem we had to get at was, why don't poor people work as much? Well, it turns out that most poor people work. And it turns out that many poor people work multiple jobs and work very hard. So the fact that we had this value-laden question often kept us from discovering accurate information. An example of a value-free question, we could ask the same kind of information in a value-free way by saying, what is the association between employment and poverty? In other words, is it true that people who work more are wealthier? We could ask those kinds of questions in a way that doesn't assume that one answer is better or worse, and that doesn't imply a foregone conclusion. I challenge, as a scholar, our ability to actually ask value-free questions. That's because we live in societies. We are products of the societies we grow up in. We don't necessarily know what our value biases are. So instead of asking value-free questions, I think the best we can really hope to do is to acknowledge our bias, to understand where we're coming from and what values are implied through our research, and to consider our positions as researchers. So, for example, even when we ask questions like, what makes a society more democratic, are we assuming that democratic societies are better than less democratic societies? Probably, because we come from a democratic society that really prizes democracy. So considering the fact that that's our position and that those are our biases when we do this research helps to frame the results we get. Even if we can't ask value-free questions, we can be aware of what our values are. So we also need to know what the goals of our research are before we set out. When we set out to do research, we need to know what our unit of analysis is. We need to know what method we're going to use. We need to know what kinds of arguments we can make based on whether we're collecting cross-sectional data or longitudinal data. We also need to know what the goals of our research are. Do we want to just describe a phenomenon? sometimes that's good enough. Sometimes a phenomenon lacks description. We don't have a good understanding of what something is or what's going on. This is often true for marginalized cultures or the experiences of marginalized groups. It's often a good starting point, right? A necessary starting point to just describe what's happening. A next step we could take would be exploratory. So, how is a phenomenon happening? We can observe relationships among different phenomena and provide rich description of phenomena. Rich description means we're not just saying, this is what happened. We're saying, this is what happened. Here are the people involved. This is what the people involved seem to be feeling. This is what the people involved said about what was going on. This is what was happening around the same time. This is what I was doing while this was happening. Rich description goes deeper than surface level description and provides insight into how things work. Finally, we can try to do explanatory research. We can try to identify causal relationships and actually generate theory. So we can try to identify principles of what causes things to happen in certain ways. So we need to know when we set out to do our research, whether we're trying to describe a phenomenon, explore how a phenomenon is happening, or explain why a phenomenon is happening the way it is. So these are goals we need to set before we design our research, or else we may either fall short or do the wrong kind of work, ask the wrong kinds of questions to get what we need out of the research. So let's stop here and check our understanding. I'm going to navigate to the next slide, and I encourage you to pause the video and just answer these questions for yourself or with a partner. Okay, having stopped and checked for understanding, I want to pick up and talk about the role of theory in research. This is from chapter 2 of your text, so I'm going to trust you to read a lot of this on your own, but I want to go over it in broad strokes and help you understand some concepts that may be less clear. So briefly, I want us to talk about what theory is, what levels of abstraction theory can take, how we can use theory in doing social science research, and what the elements of theory are. So briefly, a theory is just a framework. It provides a basis for understanding our observations and provides a foundation for asking questions. We do research to confirm, refine, or expand theory. So a theory can frame social science phenomena at many levels. We can look at macro level theories, which explain big picture questions, such as interactions among societies and nations, or among social and political institutions. At the meso or mid-level, which answer questions about social groups and social structures. And at the micro level, theories which answer questions about small-scale interactions among individuals and about individual attitudes and behaviors. Theory can relate to research differently based on what approach to research we're taking. So we can do what's called grounded theory research or inductive research, where the goal is to make observations and work toward explanation. So we create new theory by creating novel research. This is often done, as I said in the last video, or the last part of this video, when we don't have a good understanding of the experiences of a group of people, when a society is just starting, when a brand new phenomenon is emerging. We don't have theories that explain that phenomenon, so we're trying to create theory through observation. An alternative approach is the deductive approach, where theory forms a foundation and we ask questions with the goals of confirming, expanding, or refining theory. So we may have a theory of how things are working, and we may ask questions that would seek to find examples of that theory working in the way we think it works, find counterexamples, or find limits to how that theory works. So we may think, sure, this theory works most of the time, but not in one particular kind of situation. Or we may think, this theory has been applied to these kinds of phenomena, but I think it would also apply to those kinds of phenomena in the same ways. So we can seek to confirm, expand, or refine an existing theory. In order to talk about what we need to discuss next, I need to define some terms for you. We need to talk about the measurement of variables. So far, we've been talking about concepts, relationships among concepts. So when we were talking about relationships like correlation and causation, we talked about relationships among concepts. I want to move forward to talking about variables. So a variable is a measure of a concept that can take on different values. A value is a set state of a variable. So backing up, we start with a concept, and then we conceptualize. We define that concept. So an example might be, we've all heard theories about tall people being more popular, right? So I might want to know if this is true. Are tall people more popular? So my concept is tall, a tall person. Are tall people more popular? Well, what do I mean by tall? How will I observe whether a person is tall or not? Well, most people think of tall in relationship to height. We think of how high a person is from their feet to their head. So the measure or operationalization of tall would be height. From there, I get to a variable. How am I going to actually measure the concept of height? Well, I'm going to go with inches. I'm going to go with someone's height in inches from the ground to the top of their head. That's my variable. Now that variable can take on all kinds of values. Not every possible value. People can't be any height, but they can be a wide range of heights. They can range in height from just a few inches off the ground, say 20 or so at birth, to many, many inches off the ground, perhaps as many as 80 or 90 inches off the ground, right? Very many. Each possible state of inches in height, or height in inches, is a value. So an example would be a person who was 64 inches tall. That would be a value on the variable of height in inches. I hope this is helpful. Please post if you have questions. When we talk about relationships among variables, we typically talk about independent or predictor variables and dependent or outcome variables. And we've already talked about the idea of temporal priority and logical priority. So we generally determine that a variable is independent or a predictor if we think that it occurs first in time, or if we think that it has the potential to influence other variables logically. And we typically determine that a variable would be dependent or an outcome if it occurs later in time or could not logically influence other variables. So an example might be taking antidepressants and mood state. We typically think that taking antidepressants would influence mood state. Of course, it's also possible that mood state would affect whether or not a person chose to take antidepressants. So, logically, either of these things could affect the other. So which thing occurred first in time? Did we start measuring mood state when a person began taking antidepressants? In that case, antidepressants would have temporal priority and would be our independent predictor. Another element of theory is that theories generally posit relationships among variables. So now that we've defined what variables are, and we've talked about how variables are measured and whether they're dependent or independent, theories generally hypothesize or explain relationships among concepts or variables. So a positive correlation is a relationship where as one variable increases, another variable also increases. So as education increases in a society, income increases in that society. That's a positive or direct correlation. A negative or inverse correlation is when X or one variable increases, Y, the other variable decreases. So based on my research, when social interaction increases, depression decreases. This is a negative or inverse correlation. The two variables are related, but in opposite ways. A more complex way in which variables can relate to each other is through mediation. So going back to our previous example of education leading to an increase in education leading to an increase in income, it's possible that education relates directly to income. It's possible that when I get a master's degree, I get a pay raise. When I get a PhD, I get another pay raise. When I complete additional certifications and trainings, I get another pay raise. That's possible. It's also possible that as I gain more education, I qualify for better forms of employment and am more likely to be employed in the first place, which leads to higher income. So it's possible that a third variable, employment, helps to explain or mediate the relationship between education and income. That's all education means, is that an in-between, that's all mediation means, is that an in-between variable, like employment, helps to explain at least part of the relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. So another form of relationship that variables can have with each other is moderation. A moderation relationship is when a third variable z strengthens or weakens the relationship between x and y. So going back to my example of education and income, a third variable like racism could affect how much education impacts income. So we know, for example, that white people with only a high school education have more money, more income than black people who have a college degree. We know this is true, and the explanation for this is racism in various forms. So discrimination in hiring, discrimination in promotion, job sector segregation, but structures of racism limit how much education can affect income for people of color. A third factor, Z, is weakening the relationship between education and income for some people and strengthening it for others. The next element of theory we want to talk about are hypotheses. Theories generally come with hypotheses or test hypotheses. So a hypothesis is the formal statement of a relationship among variables. And in order for a statement of a relationship to be a hypothesis, it has to be measurable and it has to be falsifiable. So a poor hypothesis would be hugs are good. Hugs are good. Well, how do you measure good? Good for what? Good in what way? Good for whom? If you hate hugs, hugs are bad. Second, it must be falsifiable. How can you prove hugs aren't good? How much harm would a hug have to do to prove that it was bad and not good? Hugs are good is a terrible hypothesis. Experiencing more positive physical touches is related to lower blood pressure would be a fine hypothesis. Positive physical touches are something we can measure. That could simply be a physical touch that a person enjoys. And blood pressure is certainly measurable. We can use a blood pressure cuff to measure someone's blood pressure. It's also falsifiable. That is, it can be proven to be not true. If more positive touches don't result in lower blood pressure, then we've just proved the hypothesis false. We've falsified it. Another element of hypothesizing is the idea of a null hypothesis. A null hypothesis is just the statement that nothing is happening. Generally, the null hypothesis is what we want to disprove. If I state a hypothesis of a relationship among variables, I'm hypothesizing that something is happening. The other possibility, of course, is that nothing is happening. So maybe hugs are good in that more positive touches are related to low blood pressure. But maybe positive touches aren't related to blood pressure in any way at all. That's the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is the opposite of what you're trying to prove. So there are three ways we can think about what a hypothesis is. Three kinds of relationships a hypothesis can state. And I'm just going to briefly go over these because we're going to talk about them more later when we have more tools for thinking about them. So we could make a hypothesis of difference. That is, that two groups differ on a given variable. So I could say people who receive more positive touches will have lower blood pressure than people who receive fewer positive touches. I could also make a hypothesis of association. That would be people who receive more positive touches, or people who receive positive touches have lower blood pressure. In other words, having more, as positive touches increase, blood pressure will decrease to a certain point. I could also make a causal hypothesis. Your book calls this a hypothesis of association of difference. The way to think about this most clearly is that changes in one variable cause changes in another variable. So if I say that positive touches are associated with lower blood pressure, I'm really hypothesizing that being touched positively more often will cause blood pressure to go down. It wouldn't make logical sense to argue that having lower blood pressure makes you hug more or touch people positively more often. So given logical priority, I'm proposing a causal relationship in which changes in the number of positive touches you receive cause changes in your blood pressure. I hope this is clear to you. If it's not, please let me know in the comments. on the discussion forum or via email. So I propose that you stop here again and check for understanding. I've given you some questions that you can consider to check understanding. And I propose that you pause the video here for a few minutes. I'm going to go on and talk about what to look forward to over the next couple of weeks. So, looking forward, I want to talk about this week's activities, scheduling meetings with me, and working together. So, your weekly activities are to, I'm assuming you've already watched this video or you wouldn't be at this point, post to the lecture discussion forum, and that's just one question or one comment. If you haven't already, I suggest that you go ahead and read chapters 1 and 2, and then maybe rewatch any parts of the video that were unclear to you. I propose that you skip the sections on theory and paradigms for now in chapters 1 and 2. You are invited to participate in a lab meeting on Wednesday at 12:30. This meeting is optional, and if no one shows up by 12:45, I'll call it and end the meeting. But as long as 1 or 2 people show up by 12:45, I will have the meeting and I will record the meeting for anyone who can't attend. So it's on you to kind of decide whether the meeting will take place or not by deciding to show up on time. I also want you this week by Thursday at 5 to participate in the reading discussion forum, and you're to complete 3 activities in any combination. So the 3 activities you can do are answer one of my reading discussion questions, create your own reading discussion questions, or respond to a colleague's reading discussion question that they've created. So you can answer 2 of my questions and then create your own. That would add up to 3. You can respond to 2 colleagues' questions and then answer one of mine. That would add up to 3. You can do these things in any combination. You can create 3 of your own discussion questions, and that's 3. So there were some questions about exactly how that looked last time, but that's what I expect you to do. Any 3 of these 3 things. I want you to hurry and schedule meetings with me. Meetings are helpful. You can discuss your topic proposal, check your understanding of concepts, and just introduce yourself to me so I know what you're working on and what your concerns are. I encourage you not to procrastinate because toward the end of this semester, everyone will want to talk to me, and I won't know who they are. Don't procrastinate scheduling meetings with me. Hurry and get on my schedule. And don't be nervous. I'm incredibly friendly. I understand that these lectures are somewhat boring, but in person, I'm really very nice. So please don't hesitate to just say hello and introduce yourself or to ask anything that's concerning you. I'm here for you. In terms of working together, go ahead and identify a study partner, create study groups via GroupMe, and create and share a Google Doc with your classmates. Email me if you need any help figuring out how to do this. I'm happy to try. This concludes my lecture for the week. Please watch the video as many times as you want, complete the reading, and consider participating in Wednesday's lab. Let me know if you need help through the discussion forums or through email. And I will look forward to talking to you again later in the week.